Welcome to another episode of 40 Minutes in the Old Testament. 40 Minutes in the Old Testament is a 1517 podcast network podcast. You can go to 1517.org/podcast and check out all the other podcasts that are living over there. And while you're over there, make sure you check out everything else that 1517 is doing. All the academies, all the videos, all the other podcasts, the events. A lot of stuff going on over there. Check it all out. While you're over there also, if you want to support this show, and just the work of 1517 in general, you can, of course, do that by hitting the donate link up in that upper right-hand corner, and you can become a supporter of the work. And that is how we're able to do it. That's why it's all free. That's why you're not getting no ads or paywalls or any of that on this podcast. You can still go back and listen to the very first episode. You don't got to be a member or anything for that. You can go do that, and that's why. So, if you have not joined up with us, we'd appreciate it if you would. Chad, we are starting a new book today, a book unlike any other book. I mean, there's only one book like this in the Bible, I can tell you that. And that is the Song of Songs, or Song of Solomon, as some like to call it.
Yeah, in fact, the very reason we started this podcast 10 years ago was so that we could eventually get to this book. I mean,
yeah,
I don't want to let the cat out of the bag, but that is the truth. 10 years ago, you said, hey, I think we should really talk about the Song of Songs, but to get there, we have to cover Genesis all the way through Ecclesiastes. So it's been a long preparation just for this.
So I grew up with a lot of Bible reading plans and a lot of reading the Bible through in a year and that kind of stuff, and did that a lot. And this was like the only book that would make me uncomfortable, like as like a 11-year-old, you're reading, Judges, and there's like all kinds of stuff that makes me uncomfortable now, because like you're like, oh, it's so violent and bloody and horrific, and that didn't really bother me then. You're just like, oh well, people getting killed. Yeah, whenever it came time to read this, though, you'd be like, am I supposed to read this? Should I be reading this?
Is this adult literature? Yeah. So I have to respond with a quote from Rabbi Akiva. And I don't care which commentary you open, I guarantee you they will have this quote near the beginning. It's usually under the category of its place in the canon. So here's the famous quote from Rabbi Akiva. And this was in the context of the canonicity of the Song of Songs. He says, "The whole world is not worth the day on which the Song of Songs was given to Israel. All the writings are holy, and the Song of Songs is the holy of holies."
Oh wow!
So yeah, I mean that's a pretty big stamp
he liked it
from this late first century AD rabbi.
He's one of the few guys, when you ask him what his favorite book of the Bible is, he's like Song of Songs, like, obviously.
Song of Songs. Yeah. You know what is pretty amazing to me is that not only him, but man, you look at especially, well, early Christianity for sure, but when you get into the medieval period and you start looking at the literature that's produced on the Song of Songs, it is phenomenal. I mean, phenomenal in the sense of just the extent of the literature. There's some psychological stuff going on here, but a bunch of monks, and, sitting around they really meditating they really like this book on the Song of Songs. And so, I mean, you take Bernard of Clairvaux, for instance, who was to some extent influential on Martin Luther. And what was that number? I just saw it the other day. He preached like 85 sermons, not on the Song of Songs, on the first 2 chapters of the Song of Songs.
Wow.
So, I remember probably 3 or 4 years ago, I was reading some of his sermons on this, and the opening line, "Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth." I don't know. He's got, I forget the number, 5 or 6 sermons on that alone. Wow. What was going on was, I mean, this was, as we'll talk about in a minute when we talk about how you interpret the book. And this was treated for centuries mainly as an allegory of like the individual soul with Christ or with Christ in the church. And so when you allegorize something, you get hyper creative on the way that you're going to interpret these things. Oh, and what do the 2 breasts represent on on the lover, on Solomon's lover. Well, that's got to be one is the Old Testament, one is the New Testament, and from these we draw the spiritual nourishment of the word. So, I mean, that's one example of how where you end up when you allegorize thing, and I think that was one of the ways, one of the reasons, because of its sensual nature, of course, its romantic genre, but also the hyper allegorizing that took place. This was like a huge open door that people could walk through to exercise their creativity, coming up with, you know, it one of the problems when you allegorize is there's very few like parameters.
Right. Yeah.
So, I say, oh, well, the two fawns, which are her two breasts, represent the Old and the New Testament. And you come along maybe and say, well, no, I really think it's along the gospel. And somebody else comes along and says, actually, I think it's Paul's epistles and the four gospels. So it's wide open as to what people want to say about these things. So yeah, it ended up being a hugely popular book for several centuries. But
There
Rabbi
is
Akiva liked it too.
there is part of it too, like especially if you think about this being translated, if you were to go to like to the King James version of this, right? And you were to read it, and then you were to go read some like Shakespeare, and I mean, it's not hard to see like that it sounds similar, right? Like, I mean, these
Yeah,
sound like
yeah.
things that come out of the mouths of like Shakespearean figures or whatever, especially if you're reading it in like the King's English or whatever. And so there is definitely like you could, and obviously it far predates that stuff, and so that you can sort of see that influence there because it is the thing in the Bible that sounds like that.
Yeah, that kind of antiquated poetry with these highly metaphorical figures, most of which are, I mean, there's some that, if we read it in some sort of modern romance poetry, we wouldn't blink. Sometimes, like there's a line somewhere in here about, someone getting caught in the trussels of her hair, something like that. I don't think that would strike us as too strange. But, if I compare her nose to a tower or her teeth to sheep, then of course that's going to be really weird to us. But a lot of this, yeah, it does have this very kind of Shakespearean feel, and because that, I mean, it's kind of strange to us. But hopefully, by the time we work our way through some of the details, it won't seem quite as strange. Uh, so I've been reading several commentaries, getting ready for the start of this, and it's amazing to me that yeah, people take this so many different directions.
Yeah.
It's almost like you put Song of Songs beside Revelation, and there's so many different takes on Revelation. Almost as many takes
Of
on.
course, the definitive one is the 30 minutes in the New Testament one.
Oh
Which
yeah, yeah,
so if you want to know like the definitive Revelation take, you can go look that up.
yeah. I mean that goes without saying.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I said it
yeah.
anyway.
So you've got. I mean, I broke these down into I think three or four different categories. I've already mentioned one, the allegorical, where it's kind of like if you're not familiar with allegory, just think of Animal Farm, or if you're more familiar with Pilgrim's Progress,
Hmm.
both of those are allegories. They're saying one thing, but what they're really teaching you is something else. So one thing stands for something else. So I'm talking about A, but what I really mean is B. And I'm talking about the Animal Farm, but I'm actually talking about, the Russian Revolution or communism, or I'm talking about Christians' progress through this world, but I'm actually talking about the journey of every Christian. So there's that approach, and I mean, you'll still see that today, but it was very popular among a lot of the church fathers and on up into the time of the Reformation. But there are also some people today who you find isolated cases throughout church history, like Theodore Mopsuestia. He held this too, that it's a love song and nothing more than a love song. Some people today will say, well, this is there's nothing religious about this. They'll argue that God's name is never mentioned, even though most people would argue that it is. I think that's chapter 8, verse 6. But even so, one mention of the Lord's name in the whole book. So the Psalm, this is nothing more than just religious poetry. Well, yeah, my problem with that is that you number one, it's in the canon itself, which immediately adds context to it. And Solomon's mentioned here, of course, who's deeply rooted in the canonical story. And you've got plenty of other examples in the Old Testament where the marriage of a man and a wife, particularly man and wife, like the prophet Hosea and Gomer, or even Psalms like Psalm 45, which is a love song, really a wedding song about the king and his marriage to a foreign princess. I mean, you got plenty of other examples in the Bible where marriage or the love between a man and a woman is iconic of the marriage between the Lord and Israel, or between Christ and the church. So I don't think really that the treating it just as a religious or as a love song, a non-religious love song works. So this is, I don't know, this is my take on it. This is the way I approach the Song of Songs. I see it as you could call it number one, analogical. So an analogy where you have these two lovers, Solomon and the Shulamite, and by analogy, the love that they share is also the love shared by Yahweh and Israel, Christ and his church. And alongside that is kind of a typological approach where you see what's happening here as a type or foreshadowing of the love between Christ and his church. And for me, that seems to be the best approach because number one, it takes seriously the fact that this is a love song. And so it's not an allegory, it is a love song. There's plenty of metaphors and symbols and all that kind of stuff in it that you would expect of Hebrew poetry. But it's not just a love song because it's in the canon. And because of that, it's connected to all the other parts of the salvation story. So it's pointing by analogy or by typology to the relationship between Christ and his bride, the church. So anyway, that's the way that I approach it, and it seems to fit best with I think our overall approach if we read it that way.
I've kind of approached this as a, and this don't turn this off the second I say this. Listen to the end of what I say. Okay, so kind of the initial thing I'm going to say first is going to sound like, oh, don't say that. When I read the Song of Solomon, I read it as a little bit of a fantasy, and what I mean by that is that it's not just like Solomon writing a love song to a person. There's like a dialogue that's happening in this, right? Like this is it'd be one thing if it was just like, this is how I feel about this woman. You'd be like, okay, sure. Like that makes sense. You're really, man, you really got it bad for this woman, and you're really going to let the world know exactly how you feel about her. And so easy enough. But this is actually, you have different players within this song. Right? So you have her words and his words and some other people's words, like what other people are saying. And so, and by fantasy, I don't mean that in like this sort of like crude way. What I mean is that like as like an ideal, right? And so if you think about who Solomon is, and by the way, feel free to like completely obliterate what I'm saying here. You think about who Solomon is, he's a guy with like, who's famous for one thing most of all, which is this guy's got like how many wives does he end up with? I mean, like it's like
700 wives, 300 concubines.
Yeah, he's got like 1,000 women.
Yeah, he's got 1,000 women. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and it seems as though, I mean, we just got done with Ecclesiastes. This does not seem to have really helped him at all. This does not seem to have like filled the void. He has not like extracted all the necessary meaning for life from this endeavor. Like far from it. This does not happen. But that doesn't mean like that Solomon's not like a lover. I would actually say like it's the opposite of that. Sometimes you get this idea of Solomon that he's just like a lust-filled maniac, which maybe, I mean, he's a man and a sinner, so sure. But it's also, it could be that he's also like maybe this like hopeless romantic that is like looking for like this real thing, right? And so in this, you have, I feel like this song and yet this like story of like of what it would look like if you had like the real thing. Like if you like this is what you really need. Like that's what I mean by a fantasy. This is the ideal. And of course that I think this does then apply to Christ and his church and like only God could love a bride this way. You and so that I don't know, that's been helpful to me, like to think of it sort of that way, where you're almost like, man, if love could be all that it was supposed to be, like it would sound like this. Like this is what
Yeah.
she would say, and these are the sorts of things that he would say, and these are the sorts of things that other people witnessing it would say. Um, and then you can like say, but this is sort of you do have this in Christ and his church, even though Solomon obviously couldn't find this with any one of the thousand. This is what it would be like if I ever found the thing.
The ideal woman. Yeah. Yeah, I think that that argument holds water. The other the I don't even this is not contradictory to what you said. I think another way of taking this would be to that he's speaking about at least a woman that he's found who is as close to ideal
Yeah.
as he can imagine. Uh, and there's some who argue that this is this kind of sounds funny because people will talk about the young Luther and the old Luther. We've read the old Solomon,
Yeah.
Ecclesiastes. So this is like the young Solomon. He's just become king, and he's just fallen head over heels with this gal who's only named in one place in chapter 6, verse 13 as the it's not even her name, just where she's from, the Shulamite. So the Shulamite is this lover, and she is just yeah, he's stricken. I mean, he's head over heels in love with her. And so some people take you got old Solomon, Ecclesiastes, young Solomon, Song of Songs, and I don't know, it kind of fits for me that this sounds like a guy who's not quite as old and jaded as Ecclesiastes
Oh
is.
yeah.
Yeah,
Well, well,
he's
imagines. You can imagine this easily. So both these things can be true at once. This is probably not a recounting of the conversations he's having with her and what other people are saying. Uh, but if you like, so if you meet somebody, if you meet the Shulamite, and man, she's something, and you go and you're having a wonderful time with her, and then you go back and you put pen to paper, you might project a little bit about like what you think this could be, right? You're like, I mean,
yeah,
this feels
you
like this.
fantasize,
Yeah,
right?
this is
Like you
it.
said.
Yeah, that's what
Yeah.
I'm talking about. Is like where you're like, man, oh man, and whether it's an actual person that you're putting this on, or an idea of a person, or whatever it is, but you're saying you're feeling it, man, and like, and I think that the truth though of the whole thing is that actually, Chad, you and I are both married. I love my wife; she's great. You love your wife; she's great. Did better than either of us deserve, for sure. But like I mean, this doesn't like describe our conversations. Like it's
This doesn't sound like our pillow talk.
no, and just like your affections aren't this. I don't know.
Arduous.
Yeah, like it's just not like that. But there's a pure. It's weird because like yeah, it is kind of like sensual and stuff. But there's also like sort of a naivety and like a innocence to it where you're like,
Mm-hmm.
which you only get like obviously with like a pure love between like Christ and his bride.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that actually fits with another point I wanted to make about this. That I can't remember where I saw this quote, but somebody said the Song of Songs is basically an extensive commentary on that closing verse of Genesis 2, where the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's a very Edenic quality to this. I mean, both in the sense of kind of an idealistic state of love between a man and a woman, but also, I mean, this thing is full of all kinds of sensual imagery. Both, all the senses are hit here: taste and sight and smell and feeling. I mean, everything is there. So it does have kind of this paradise quality to it, which would again fit with kind of the theme of innocence
Yeah, yeah.
and the youthfulness of love and
Mm-hmm.
unpolluted by all the stuff that happens
Well,
in
he's
life,
excited
all the
about
stuff that
things
happens
that
in our world.
yeah, well, man, dude, he's excited about things that you just don't get excited about, and as you're older. Like there's things that he says here that you're like what are you, like 15? What is going on here? Like it's like your hand accidentally brushed up against someone else's hand and then you read way too much into it, and you're like, what's happening here, man?
Yeah. And I mean, him and her, this is reciprocal. That's one of the, that is one of the things that was surprising to me actually is that, oh, I forget the stats, but one scholar quoted somebody saying basically that of the speeches of the woman, they comprise like 53 or 54% of the book. And the speech, and then you have the chorus, this other group, Daughters of Jerusalem, or whatever you want to call them. But the man, Solomon, speaking here is just like 30 something. So that is one of the uniquenesses of the book is she's speaking these words to him and he's speaking these words back to her. And occasionally you'll have this group, this chorus, as it were, singing along, but it's dominated by her voice,
Mm-hmm.
which is it's pretty remarkable that if you I do believe Solomon wrote this book. I mean, that's highly disputed by in the scholarship, but I take it as it stands. I mean, Solomon makes sense to me that would be the author of something like this.
Well, also, dude, you might. I mean, if you're idealizing something in your head too, and you're like, oh man, I just met whether you just met somebody or whatever. Yeah, part of this is like, how would you want to be loved? I mean, it's like this is of course, like she's gonna do a lot of talking, and you're like, these are the words that I know. I'm gonna tell you how I feel about her. Oh, but I would like this. Surely, like if I could have anything, it would be for you to feel this way about me.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, it's gonna be I think it's gonna be an interesting book. It's a little bit difficult to find where the sections begin and end and how to structure because it's not like some people compare it to a play, and I understand that because it does kind of feel like you got the male actor, you got the female actor, you kind of got this like a almost like a Greek chorus over here singing sometimes. You got that going on, but a play has like it's laid out. Got this act, then following into this act and that act, and that's pretty difficult for me to discern. I mean, there are some that break it down that way. The typical Jewish reading of this is that this is sort of a historical allegory depicting the various stages of Israel's history. And that's one of the reasons for instance, so this is Song of Songs is part of what are called the Megilloth, which just means 5 scrolls. And there are certain biblical books, scrolls that are read at the annual festivals. And so Song of Songs is always read at Passover because it's interpreted to mean that this is what happened when Israel was in captivity and then they were brought out and they had the whole Exodus and so on and so forth. So that's one of the reasons that it's read at that time is because this is part of the Jewish understanding of the song. But it doesn't really have, in my opinion, that well laid out structure. You kind of go from scene to scene, and some of them are about anticipation, some of them are about being together, and some of them are about a temporary separation, then a reunion, and some of them are about a longer separation. So it seems to me that it's just kind of a constellation of the various experiences that these two lovers have as they're either together or anticipating being together or apart for a time. And the way it works is she speaks and he speaks, and sometimes other people speak. So you got several different actors, but mainly the man, the woman, and then these daughters of Jerusalem who occasionally will step in and have their little say.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I mean, like, I think like Christ and the church as his bride like helps this a lot for the Jewish understanding of it. When you're like, this is about God and Israel, you're like, well, Christ and his bride like helps this feel like a little more direct because you do have then like a man and like his bride, the people of God, the church. But even God when he speaks to Israel, as we've gone over many times, when they are straying away from him, he does speak about them in like a wife in the sense that he calls them like adulterer. It's always in a negative sense, like they're a bad wife, like they're
Yeah,
they're
right. Yeah.
they're whores and
Always stepping
adulterers,
out on
and
him.
but there is still that sort of language. It's not as like direct. There's Christ and his bride, the church, and so on one hand, I think that sort of Jewish interpretation is right as far as like, yeah, sure, like could this apply in a way to God and his people at all times and places? Sure.
Sure. Yeah.
But man, having the person of Christ and his bride, the church, come along really makes this a lot easier, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, oh yeah, you kind of read the Song of Songs with one eye cast to Ephesians 5,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where you have this beautiful description of what Christ has done for his church. And even, verses like 2 Corinthians 11, where Paul says, he says, I betrothed you to one husband to present you as a pure virgin to Christ. So he sees his role as an apostle of kind of I don't know, a matchmaker, I suppose. Like he's betrothal agent. He's bringing together this pure virgin of the church to Christ. He's kind of betrothed those together. So, yeah, I mean, certainly in the Old Testament, but more explicitly in the New Testament, you have this image of the bride of Christ, the corporate body of believers as being his beloved,
Yeah.
the one he's cleansed and made his own. And this just happens to be the Old Testament, very expansive, sensual description of this love, which it's pretty remarkable. I mean, I don't know how many people preach like this when they're talking about the love of Christ for his bride.
Yeah.
It might make the congregation a little bit uncomfortable, understandably so. But this is the ideal love. So if you were to take a man and a woman, put them together without any issues, any problems, just two people madly, passionately in love with each other, both giving and receiving, then this is what this would sound like. At least this is what would sound like in the style of Hebrew poetry.
Yeah. All right, should we
Well,
get into a verse?
we should get into a verse. I mean, that was about a
29 minutes.
30-minute introduction to this, but hopefully that was helpful as we start our way through this. So I should note that depending on the Bible that you're using, sometimes you'll have like designations in here. Like I'm looking at the ESV, which not only will give a title for this section, which they say the bride confesses her love, but throughout this, it'll have a she, and then it'll say others, and then she, and then he. So go back and forth. And if your Bible has those, keep in mind that's not part of the original.
Right.
You won't find these kind of designations in the Hebrew. Although I will point out that some of the earliest Greek manuscripts we have of the Old Testament, like Codex Sinaiticus, already then in the early centuries of the church, they were designating the speakers like in the margin. So this goes way back. This is just it's supposed to be helpful for people to understand who's speaking, because if you're reading in English, you can't always tell. Hebrew has a way, like a lot of languages have a way, like they have gender with nouns, so masculine nouns, feminine nouns, and you can tell when you're reading it in the original if it's a man speaking or if it's a woman speaking or if it's a group speaking. You can't always tell that in translation. So that's one of the reasons that in many Bibles today they'll actually have the sections labeled she, he, or they. So let's see what she says. You start out here with the heading of the entire thing. It's called the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. In Hebrew, that's the Song of Songs is Shir HaShirim, and this is the Hebrew superlative. So that's we would say the best of songs. But just like, the Holy of Holies is the most holy place, or the King of Kings is the greatest king. So the Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, is the finest or the best of the songs, which is Solomon's. And of course, this is where we get the title also, the Song of Solomon. So after the title, here's what she says. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is better than wine. Your anointing oils are fragrant. Your name is oil poured out. Therefore, virgins love you. Draw me after you. Let us run. The king has brought me into his chambers. So I mean, there's no like lead into this. She jumps right in, uh, and this is probably best rendered something like, "Let him smother me with kisses. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth." And why would this doesn't work so well in our culture? Because when you think about a kiss, of course, we always think about a kiss where one person's mouth is touching another person's mouth. But we do have evidence in the ancient Near East that sometimes there were nose kisses, which are still happen in some cultures today. So she's saying, I don't want like a peck on the cheek, or I don't want a nose kiss. I want the real thing. I want your lips on my lips, and not just once, but I want you to, as it were, smother me with kisses. So let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. And then she transitions from that to say that his love is better than wine. Now, depending on the translations you're looking at, many of them will just say love. This is a plural, dodim. Dode is the singular, dodim is the plural here. And a pretty strong case can be made from the other occurrences of the plural of this word throughout the rest of the Old Testament that it's not just love, but it's love making that's being talked about here. So sometimes you'll read it translated as caresses, but I would translate it love making. Your love making is better than wine. In other words, wine's good, tastes good, it's intoxicating if you have plenty of it. Well, more intoxicating, better than that is the relationship that we have together, the love making that we are enjoying. So it doesn't take long. You're all the way in with the Song of Songs.
Yeah, yeah, and not only that, but you smell good too.
Yeah, definitely smell good because your anointing oils are fragrant. Right.
And I like this is yeah, you are jumping right in, but you are like intoxicated is like the right word. Like this is somebody who is like love drunk, right? Like this person is fully intoxicated with this other person to the point where you're like, I love the way you smell. I like the way your name sounds. Like, I mean, I just say your name over and over again, and I just love it. Like, in fact, I think everybody loves it. And then because you have this, therefore virgins love you, this kind of thing. Is that this is like who couldn't love you? I mean, look at you. I mean,
Yeah,
smell
that's
you, say your
precisely.
name. Everything about you is incredible. Like, of course, everyone loves you.
Yeah, well, she's speaking to Solomon. The church is talking to Christ. And what you'll notice as when she speaks, she's hitting all the senses. I love your taste. I love your smell. I love the way you feel. I love the way you sound. All of this. And that when the guy speaks, almost without exception, he just talks about how she looks.
Yeah,
Isn't that, I mean, Solomon, master of wisdom, also understood kind of the two ways that the two sexes operate too. I mean, guys tend to be all about the eyes, right?
yeah,
So when he talks over and over about, oh, you're really beautiful, and he'll describe her beauty in any number of ways. But she hits all the senses. He's mainly focused upon sight.
and
So, and you're right. I mean, he smells good to her. His name is like oil poured out. And then she said, when she says virgins love you, she's basically saying, man, there is not a woman in sight of meritable age who is not attracted to you. Obviously, who who wouldn't love you?
yeah. And then I'm gonna straight up run into your bedroom is also what's happening. Like just, just
Yeah, precisely. That's what's happened. Yeah,
yeah,
in fact, it's a perfect follow up actually when she says virgins love you. So she's saying, I'm going to get you away from all of those.
yeah.
So verse 4, draw me after you. In fact, yeah, let's run. Run not to just get away from everybody, but she says the king has brought me into his chambers. that is the plural in Hebrew. Can mean a variety of things, but given the context and given what she's saying, then probably would translate it just as bedroom here. That's where she wants him to take her. And notice it too. There, I mean, you switch back and forth. So between like how she addresses him. So she starts out in third person, let him kiss me, let him smother me with kisses. But then she switches to speak of him directly. Your anointing oils are fragrant. But then in verse 4, she switches again to third person and she refers to him as a king. So the king has brought me into his chambers. Now, if that seems kind of jarring to you, well, that's just the way the Hebrew poetry works. It's always jumping back and forth between direct address and third person address. That's not unusual for this kind of poetry. That's just the way it works.
No, the thing that's maybe the most uncomfortable is that, as two guys sitting here breaking this down, is that obviously we are supposed to play the role of the she here, because obviously we're part of the bride of Christ. So this is how we would speak of Christ, and then it gets even weirder when this is how Christ speaks of us. But if you're able to get out, like, let that be. This is like this. You do see someone who is completely enraptured with this other person, and of course, this is the way that the church at least ought to be with Christ, right? Where it's like, yeah, he's the best. I mean, everything about him is everything I need. Not desiring him is insanity to you.
Yeah, and I think that can be extremely helpful to remind us. Well, let me put it this way. So there is a tendency to speak more abstractly about, call it doctrine or creeds or teachings or whatever it is, and to lose the focus upon the person of Jesus.
Yeah.
It's very easy to talk about the things that Jesus gives to us, the things that Jesus teaches us, and I'm not denigrating the importance of that. But as one hymn puts it, Jesus, Jesus, only Jesus can my heartfelt longings still. So it's all about him. And this song has a way of reminding us of that Christianity is it's not a philosophy. It's not just a body of doctrine. It's all about Christ and his love for us, as the Song of Songs will describe it, his passionate, sensual, all in kind of love for us. And then the way that we respond to that also reciprocally, where he loves us and we love him. And basically you get to the point where you can't get enough of being in the other's presence. So that is one of the beauties, and I think one of the strong messages of the Song of Songs, that it's all about Christ. It's all about our love for him and his love for us. And so that's going to be a dominating feature of the Song of Songs. I think we're done. We didn't get very far today. We got through 4.5 verses, but that's okay. We got a good lead in that we can jump in.
I can tease you with this. So you got the 4 verses. We're gonna hear from the others, as the ESV designates it. But one of the things I do like, and we'll get into this next week, is that if you think about so this is a bride, and she's letting you know how great the groom is and stuff. And one thing that happens over and over again is, man, everybody agrees. And like that's pretty, and that's sort of like, I think, like kind of how it's supposed to be. With, if you think about how you would talk about Christ to other people, you would talk about him in such a way that everyone else would also be like, well, yeah, that sounds like the best.
Sounds like the best. Yeah, great point.
Yeah, and you're going to see that happen a lot, where everyone's like, we agree. In fact, we're like, no lies detected, right? So, so we'll get into some of that next episode. All right, Chad, I'll see you then.
See you then.